this lecture, we're going to discuss turfgrass soils and fertility. Soils are obviously a very important part of turfgrass management for a number of reasons. One is, turf. Most uses of turf receive quite a bit of traffic, and traffic results in major soil problems, often, especially compaction. In addition, the perenniality of turf grasses means that we can't, like an agronomic situation, you might be able to regularly till the soil to reduce compaction, improve soil health. We can't do that in turf. So we have cultivation methods that we'll talk about later in the semester. However, tillage options are really quite limited, and this can also lead to more compaction. Also, turf is often established on rather tough sites, for instance, new construction sites, slopes, areas that otherwise can't sustain very good plant growth are often covered in turf, so these grasses have to be able to grow with very little soil quality. I just want to briefly talk about soil testing. So this is an important thing to do both before a turf is established and then during turf growth through the years. So, the main reason you would do this is to determine plants' available nutrients. And you can use then this information to make fertility decisions. So generally, the types of things you might look for in a soil test are phosphorus, potassium. You can check for some other macronutrients. One thing you wouldn't test for in this part of the country is nitrogen, mainly because nitrogen is going to leach through the soil, and it's not going to stay in the soil long enough to make a test worthwhile. So some optimal rate, typically you're going to get these soil reports back, and the phosphorus, potassium levels will be in pounds per acre or parts per million. Got a couple targets that you might want for phosphorus and potassium, but this information will all be on the soil test results. So the soil testing lab, and there's one at the University of Minnesota where you can send soil samples, will send you a report that tells you how much phosphorus and potassium you have in your soil, and then what the optimum rate should be for your given use. And in this case, it would be for turf. It's fairly easy to convert parts per million to pounds per acre. It's based on the weight of what we call an acre furrow slice, which is just an acre of soil 6 inches deep, weighs about 2 million pounds. So if you have parts per million, you can just multiply by 2, and that converts your numbers to pounds per acre. So you send into the soil testing lab, you would send a soil sample. So there's kind of some general principles to think about when sampling a turf soil. You want to take cores that are 3 to 6 inches deep. Kind of depends on the species, but that's a kind of a general rule of thumb. And you want to be consistent on your depth whenever you sample a given area. So within an area, you'd want to take many samples because areas can be quite variable. And then eventually you're going to mix these samples together, but you would only want to mix samples from similar areas. So if you had a turf area where one part of the lawn was really flat and open and sunny, and then another area that was like sloped and shady, you'd want to keep those samples separate. So you would submit 2 different samples to the soil testing lab. You'd combine all the samples from a given area together and mix it, and then take a subsample from that, and that's what you would send in then to the soil testing lab. Okay, another important concept you need to understand, it's one that you've had in introductory soil courses, is cation exchange capacity, and this is given in milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil. So cation exchange capacity is the ability of the soil to exchange cations, which are positively charged elements that are in the soil, and it just generally means that a soil with a high CEC has a lot of potential exchange sites where positively charged ions can be bound. So these soil particles have these negatively charged sites and are negatively charged, and then these positive ions, such as are listed here, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and so forth, and some nitrogen sources like ammonium, they can be held by the soil and then be available for plants. If they aren't held by the soil, they can't be available for plants. So higher CEC leads to better nutrient availability for the plant. So here's kind of a range. This is in milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil, a range of CECs. And as you can see, sand is quite low, organic matter, clay is quite high. So the reason for this is that sandy soils, sand is a very large particle compared to clay. So there's just not as much surface area. If you think about the surface area of very, very small particles compared to larger particles, this very, very small particles would have a larger surface area. So this is why sandy soils require different fertility management than, for instance, clay soils. Sandy soils, you might utilize a fertility program that involves more frequent applications of lower rates, because that nitrogen is going to move through. The other nutrients are not going to be held by the soil, and you're going to waste a lot of your fertility if you apply large amounts on these low CEC soils. So the more, like I just mentioned, the lower the CEC, the higher the leaching potential for some of these nutrients like nitrogen. So, best practice would be to use lighter, more frequent applications. For instance, on a Gulf green that's sandy, you would, rather than apply just a few applications a year, you would apply several, but just at a lower rate. So your total nitrogen input would be the same. The plant still needs the same amount of nitrogen. It's just that the soil can only hold so much of the nitrogen and other nutrients for plant availability. pH is a measure of the acidity of the soil, essentially measuring hydrogen ion activity. 6 to 7 on the pH scale is ideal for turf, so slightly acidic. 7 would be neutral, anything below is acidic, anything above is basic. You can raise the pH quite easily by liming, using liming materials, which we'll talk about in a minute here. You can lower the pH as well using sulfur applications, but it's quite difficult, and it depends on the buffering capacity of the soil. This is explained in greater detail in your text, and I would encourage you to read that section. So liming can raise the pH of an acidic soil, and one of the advantages of this is nutrient availability. So certain nutrients are more available at certain pHs, and generally the pHs near neutral lead to greater nutrient availability. Microbe activity is also better at a more neutral pH and not as good as at the extremes. And microbe activity is necessary for a lot of things. It's necessary for thatch breakdown. It can help with disease and insect biological control, essentially. And it can also, as we'll see in a few minutes, is necessary for the release of nitrogen from some of the nitrogen sources that are commonly used on turf. Liming can also lead to better root growth for some of these same reasons. What happens is these liming materials have calcium. That calcium replaces and neutralizes the hydrogen that's in the soil. Here's a chart that just shows the availability of certain nutrients at certain pHs. And you can see, in general, let me get this pen situated. In general, the greater availability for most of these, with a few exceptions, is in that neutral range. There's a few exceptions. Iron is one that's more available at lower pHs, and manganese a little bit more at lower pHs. But generally, nutrients are more available at the more neutral pH. Liming material could be applied in the spring or the fall. It generally should be incorporated, so it's better to do on a new establishment. It's easier to do on a new establishment. There's a number of different materials that can be used, kind of depending on your situation. For instance, if you knew you had magnesium deficiencies, you might use dolomitic limestone because it contains magnesium. Some people might think of gypsum as a liming material, calcium sulfate. However, it is not a liming material. What it can be used for, so it doesn't have an effect on pH. What it can be used for, however, is on soils where there's a lot of sodium. So, for instance, in Minnesota, if you had a lot of salt in your soil due to road salt from the winter, you might use little gypsum to help exchange the sodium that's on the soil colloids for, and calcium would replace the sodium. So it does have a use in turf management, but it's not a liming material. So here's a list of all the macro and micronutrients. We're just going to talk about a few of them today, and then we'll focus on nitrogen and nitrogen sources. Here's the typical mineral composition of a plant. So you can see most of what's in a plant is carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. And then the next three greatest components would be nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which are, of course, the three primary nutrients that are applied in fertilizers to turf. Calcium, magnesium, and sulfur then would be the remaining macronutrients. All the micronutrients then compose just a very, very small part of the plant. So nitrogen, of course, is the most used nutrient in terms of application on turfs. Most money is spent on this. It's obviously a very important part of turf management. It can move throughout the plant. It also is mobile in the soil, which is a problem, as you can imagine, leaching through the soil and getting into groundwater. It's an important part of many, many processes and components of plants. In terms of the effect on turf, the couple easy ones to see would certainly color. You apply nitrogen, color becomes darker right away. Density improves, roots and shoots both get promoted. Disease management can be better depending on the disease. Some diseases are low-end diseases, which means when nitrogen is deficient, they're worse on the turf, so just adding nitrogen can help them. Some diseases, however, are worse when there's a lot of nitrogen, so you want to make sure your fertility levels are at the proper rate. Plant uptake of nitrogen can be as either the nitrate or ammonium. NO3 is nitrate, and H4 plus would be ammonium. Phosphorus, as we mentioned earlier in the semester, very, very important during establishment, and this is because it doesn't really move around in the soil, it's immobile. So those germinating seeds and seedlings need to find it, and with their short radical roots, so then you need to make sure there's plenty of phosphorus for establishment because they can't go out and seek it. That's very important for maturation, root growth, nucleic acids, ATP, just a number of things in the plant where it's an important component. A couple forms that it's absorbed as are listed here, and as I mentioned before, it's immobile in the soil. It can still, so nitrogen you think of as a nutrient that can leach and cause problems in water. Phosphorus also has some environmental effects, some potentially negative effects. It can run off. So most of the phosphorus, it's not moving through the soil, but it's moving in the soil through runoff. This doesn't happen a lot from established areas, but areas where there is open turf, exposed soil, steep slopes without turf, phosphorus can run off, eventually get into the lakes and lead to eutrophication, which is a problem. It's essentially when you get this massive increase in growth of algae and other materials in the lake. Minnesota has a phosphorus law restriction on, it's essentially a restriction on phosphorus applications on turf statewide now. It started as a restriction just in the metropolitan area. This law has a couple of exceptions. One is you can apply phosphorus during establishment. As I mentioned before, establishment is very important to use phosphorus. The other is if you have completed official training, you can apply phosphorus. So a lot of golf course superintendents and turf managers take this training periodically. It's offered through the University of Minnesota. It's kind of a short kind of refresher on phosphorus. If you have that training, you can apply phosphorus as well. There's some controversy about this law because it was kind of implemented without any research base. So there's been some research done after the law was implemented that kind of indicate that, sure, putting too much phosphorus on turf is bad. However, putting too little on, especially on a deficient soil, can be problematic as well because you end up with a situation with open turf. If turf is weak and not dense, you've got more exposed soil. That soil then can run off and cause problems because Minnesota soils are typically quite high in phosphorus. So that's how, that's why this works. This law works to some degree because we generally don't need phosphorus. And I didn't mention one other situation that could be an exception for this law is if you have a soil test. So if you have a soil test taken that shows phosphorus deficiency on a site, you can apply phosphorus. So mature turf doesn't really need a lot of this, especially in Minnesota. So if you actually did apply a lot of it, it would be an advantage for weedy species. So the weedy species that are germinating during the summer, just as the turf weeds need, turf seed needs phosphorus, so do the weed seeds. So actually, overapplying phosphorus can lead to more weed problems. Common source of phosphorus would be triple superphosphate. Now, of course, when you apply fertilizers in turf, there's obviously combination products where they've formulated different NPK combinations. Potassium is, when you really think about potassium, you think about its importance as a cofactor, as a stress tolerance mechanism. It's really active in a lot of stress tolerance pathways in plants. It's unclear exactly. There's kind of a thought that it's important for winter survival of turf. It's unclear exactly the issues involved there. Like, is there really a benefit in applying a lot of potassium in the fall? A lot of your winter preparation type products that are sold by some of the companies that sell to consumers contain quite a bit of potassium. It's unclear. The research doesn't really show for sure the positive effects. It can leach. It's mobile in the plant, necessary for root growth. Seems to be associated with better wear tolerance and, like I said, stress tolerances, disease susceptibility, things like that. So a lot of important stress responses in plants, potassium is involved. It's absorbed as K+. It can be displaced in the soil by sodium, calcium, or magnesium. So if you have a lot of sodium in your soil, very high salt soils, it can be displaced and you can run into potassium deficiencies. And there's a couple different main primary sources of potassium. Just to review, when you see three numbers, those represent nitrogen, potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that order. So the first number would be percent nitrogen, second would be percent phosphorus, it's actually percent P2O5, and then the last number is percent potassium, which is actually percent K2O. Let's talk a little more about nitrogen. So on the left are the ways that nitrogen can get into a turf system or available for the plant. So fertilizers, obviously. Clippings contribute quite a bit of nitrogen. Just returning clippings can, essentially give you a pound or more of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet every year. Fixation of nitrogen by either legumes or lightning can also lead to nitrogen inputs. And then mineralization. So nitrogen can be tied up in the soil and then mineralized, and this release via mineralization is an important source of nitrogen available for the plant. So ways that nitrogen can leave the system: removing clippings or harvesting, of course. It can volatilize or denitrify into gaseous forms depending on environmental conditions. Usually high temperatures can lead to this. It can leach, go into the groundwater, it can run off the surface, and then it can be immobilized. So this would be the opposite of mineralization. It can be changed from available to unavailable forms. So here's one of the many versions of the nitrogen cycle you might see. There's a lot of movements through the system. You can see here at the bottom we have immobilization, where nitrogen is tied up as organic nitrogen, but then it can be mineralized as well. And made into plant available forms such as ammonium. So the nitrogen sources that are used for turf can be categorized in a number of different ways, but first we'll talk about either quick release nitrogen or slow release nitrogen. So quick release nitrogen, when you apply it, it's available very quickly for the plant. And because of this quick response, you can kind of control what the plant's going to do. I mean, you have more control over color effects and quality effects because you know exactly how much you're putting on, and you can assume that most of it will be available to the plant right away. These sources are often cheaper, and they do have a higher burn potential. So if you put them on plants and they sit there for a while under certain conditions, they can essentially burn down plant tissue. They can absorb a lot of water out of the atmosphere and through the plant. And then also because these materials release very quickly, they also can be prone to more leaching because you have an abundance of nitrogen being released at the same time. Not all of it will be used by the plant, so it can leach through the system into the groundwater. Slow release sources have a longer effect. One problem would be more of a non-uniform response. So because they release kind of randomly over time, you might not get quite the response you're looking for. You can make fewer applications, which is a savings in labor and time, because they're going to release over time. Less burn potential, so there's not this risk of burning down leaf material. They can also be more costly due to the processes that are needed to make them. So another way to categorize nitrogen sources is water insoluble nitrogen and water soluble nitrogen. Water insoluble nitrogen is not soluble in water, so it's slower release. There needs to be other mechanisms to break down to release the nitrogen from the fertilizer from the source. And then water soluble nitrogen can be released very quickly in water, and usually there's a combination of both of these in commercial fertilizers that you use on turf. So now we're going to talk about quick releases materials, and these are all, so there's a few ways to categorize nitrogen sources. One is inorganic versus organic. Inorganic meaning no carbon. This doesn't have anything to do with organic farming or some of the more modern terms of organic, but just meaning not having carbon. And then also you can think of them as synthetic or non-synthetic. So synthetics are produced in some way by human intervention. So this list is all synthetic materials, and the first part of the list is inorganic, so they do not have carbon, and then the last would be organic. And these are all quick release materials. So the list of inorganic materials have high burn potential. They're hygroscopic, so they draw in a lot of moisture. The organic material listed there is urea, very popular source of nitrogen because it's cheap and effective. This is really the primary source in turf. It's got some burn potential. It can volatilize. There you can see the urea molecule in the box. This is from the text, figure 5.7 from Christian's book. Just wanted to show you the process that's used to make some of these synthetic products. So this conversion here, taking atmospheric nitrogen, so there's nitrogen in the atmosphere that can be used to make ammonia, and that step is critical, and until this step was developed, we really didn't have good fertilizer products. It was just all that could be used was natural organics, such as manure. This process is called the Haber-Bosch process, and it was very critical to the development of fertilizer products. So once we were at the stage of having ammonia, NH3, a series of reactions can take place. If carbon dioxide is added, you get urea, which is the primary organic synthetic. And then if you add these other things like nitric acid, sulfuric acid, phosphoric acid, etc., there's others as well, you get ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, ammonium phosphate. So these are very high burn potential, quick release, and cheap sources though. Then if you take urea and process it further, so if you add formaldehyde, you get these urea formaldehydes. If you add isobutyraldehyde, you get IBDU, a very popular slow release product. And if you add sulfur coating, you get these sulfur coated products. So these are all then products of a reaction with urea, and they actually become quite slow release. Essentially what they are is just repeating units of urea that are bound together. So the reason this urea formaldehydes, methylene ureas, and so forth work so well is that they can be produced to varying chain lengths. So this chain of ureas can have various sizes, and the longer the chain, the more slow release it is. We'll go through each of these products in a little more detail. So IBDU 3100, 31% nitrogen, is released. The only requirement for the release is water, so you need water. So if this product, you would want to make sure there was plenty of moisture available so that it could be released as urea. Now it's still a slow release product, but it's not as slow as some other products, so the nitrogen will all be released in about 2 months. There's no need for microorganisms for release. These urea formaldehydes and other similar products, often you can identify 3 fractions. So the cold water soluble nitrogen would be readily absorbed, so it just needs cold water to be released. Cold water insoluble would be a little tougher to release, and then hot water insoluble, which would not be able to be released by water. So these products, in order to be fully released, would need microbial breakdown of those long chains. So any conditions that increase microbial activity would help with release. So for instance, microbes are more prevalent at neutral pHs. That would help with release. These are longer chain materials. Like I said, they're going to vary in chain size. It's just a bunch of ureas that are bound together. These are pretty safe. They don't burn, slower release. But because the processes take, there's more steps in the synthesis of this material, it's going to be a little more expensive. Sulfur-coated urea is a very popular product in turf, and there's other polymer-coated ureas. Essentially, it's just urea inside of a package, essentially, these small little pills that are then applied. Cracks form in the outside of the unit, and water infiltrates and helps break down the coating, and eventually nitrogen is released then as the water reacts with urea. One problem is it's very slow, and the release is quite variable depending on environmental conditions, so you might not get the response you're looking for. So those are all synthetic products, both organic and inorganic. Now, the next group we're going to talk about are what you might think of as organic, so the natural organics. So this is not man-made, just natural materials, and this would be similar to what might have been used prior to the development of the Haber-Bosch process, but there's a big push for these kind of products, as you can imagine, with more environmental concerns and so forth. So the first one is just manure. So Sustain is a product you may have heard of that is essentially packaged poultry manure. Milorganite is a product that's a result of sewage from Milwaukee, and it's quite popular, very slow release. There are also plant byproducts available, and probably the most popular and most effective is corn gluten meal that was actually discovered as a good, turns out to be both a good turf fertilizer and a pre-emergent herbicide for some turf weeds. Corn gluten meal, just a byproduct of essentially ethanol production, corn milling. And Nick Christians at Iowa State University, the author of your text, was really responsible for getting this into the market. So these natural organic nitrogen sources are quite safe in terms of burn potential. They have a very favorable perception with the public right now. They're slow release. They don't, I think people probably feel good about using them, environmental benefits and so forth. Some of the cons, cost is an issue. And if you look back at these slides, the first number there, 5, 6, and 10, respectively, in the three products, very low nitrogen. So you have to put a lot of it down. Availability is sporadic depending on microbial breakdown. And of course, microbial action is needed. So you need the proper conditions for high microbe activity. Here you can see some of the marketing that's done with some of these products and kind of playing on the the Milorganite naturally. You can see this very, very happy family, very safe with their natural organic lawn. So there's a lot of marketing out there, and this marketing costs money, which increases the cost of the products as well. Here's some names that in the past corn gluten meal has been marketed as. You'll see any number of names. Green Sense, Concern, these kind of things that kind of play to people's images of environmental friendliness. So that's it on nitrogen sources. I just want to quickly run through a few other nutrients. Calcium, another macronutrient that may be necessary to add in some situations, and it can be added via liming materials and gypsum, of course. Magnesium is critical because it's part of the chlorophyll molecule. So if you're short on magnesium, you might have some issues with maximum photosynthesis. It's also important for several other biochemical processes. Dolomitic limestone, I mentioned before. Dolomitic lime is a way that this can be added to a turf. Iron would be the most likely micronutrient deficiency. There are a few others that could be a problem, manganese and boron, for instance. But in turf, we primarily see iron as a problem, especially when the pHs are high, so it might not be available at lower pHs. You can spray a little bit of iron on a deficient turf and you'll see the effect of green color on the turf in just minutes. You can watch it turn darker green. And this is because it's a very important component of the chlorophyll biosynthesis pathway. So there's a number of forms that can be used to apply iron, but it's got a really quick response, and it's probably the micronutrient you might deal with nutrient deficiencies on in turf. This is all we'll cover in this lecture. I just want to remind you to pay attention. Read these chapters in your book. Pay attention and read through some of the other micronutrients as well, just so you can have a good background on some of the other potential problems that could occur in turf. This is the end of this lecture.